A man sits alone in his penthouse, surrounded by empty picture frames. Each frame gleams gold, perfectly arranged, waiting for something that will never come. Marcus had everything a successful man was supposed to want: the corner office, the imported watch, the admiring glances from colleagues. But none of it satisfied the gnawing hunger that lived beneath his ribs. He told himself what every ambitious man tells himself: he was building towards something greater. He was collecting achievements like rare coins, each one bringing him closer to the moment when he would finally feel complete. Then she walked into the boardroom that Tuesday morning, and everything shifted. Elena moved with the kind of effortless grace that seemed to bend gravity around her. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. She was the kind of woman who existed in magazines and dreams, untouchable, luminous, seemingly carved from moonlight and ambition. Marcus found himself studying her the way a botanist studies a rare orchid. He began timing his coffee breaks to coincide with hers, memorizing the rhythm of her laugh, the way she tilted her head when she disagreed with someone. He convinced himself this was attraction, this careful cataloging of her every gesture. He didn't recognize it for what it truly was: the desperate hunger of a collector who had found the one piece that would complete his exhibition of self-worth. For months, he crafted the perfect approach. He learned her preferences: Ethiopian coffee, not Colombian; Haruki Murakami, not Stephen King; classical music during late nights, jazz during early mornings. He became an expert in the architecture of Elena, building detailed blueprints of who she was, or rather, who he imagined she might be beneath the carefully maintained surface. When he finally asked her to dinner, she said yes with a smile that seemed to contain multitudes. The restaurant was perfect: dim lighting that cast flattering shadows, a wine list thick as a novel, white tablecloths that whispered elegance with every fold. Marcus had rehearsed conversation topics, prepared anecdotes that would reveal his depth without seeming desperate. He was performing the role of the sophisticated suitor, and for the first time in months, he felt in control. But something strange began to happen as the evening progressed. The more Elena revealed of herself, her actual thoughts, her genuine laugh, the way she unconsciously drummed her fingers when she was thinking, the more Marcus felt himself pulling back. She wasn't the ethereal creature he had been pursuing. She was human. She had opinions that contradicted his, experiences that had nothing to do with him, a complex inner life that existed entirely independent of his careful observation. By the time the dessert arrived, Marcus realized with growing horror that he wasn't interested in knowing Elena at all. He was interested in possessing the idea of Elena, the fantasy woman he had constructed from stolen glances and overheard conversations. The real Elena, sitting across from him with chocolate on her lower lip, talking passionately about urban beekeeping, was a stranger who had somehow invaded his perfect romantic narrative. As Schopenhauer understood so clearly, what we mistake for love is often nothing more than the will's clever disguise, a biological imperative dressed up in poetry and candlelight. Marcus thought he was falling in love, but he was only falling into the trap of his own projected desires. The relationship continued for 3 months, each week bringing Marcus closer to a truth he wasn't prepared to face. Elena would text him pictures of sunsets that moved her to tears, and he would respond with calculated enthusiasm while feeling nothing. She would share stories from her childhood, and he would listen with the polite attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak. She would reach for his hand while they walked, and he would take it while mentally cataloging how her fingers felt smaller than he had expected. The end came, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet unraveling. Elena began to notice the way his eyes went distant when she spoke about things that mattered to her. She saw how he seemed more interested in being seen with her than in actually seeing her. She realized, with the terrible clarity that comes to women who have learned to read the signs, that she was not a person to him. She was a prize. The night she ended it, Marcus sat in his penthouse, surrounded by all his empty frames, finally understanding the horrible joke he had played on himself. He had chased the wrong thing entirely. He hadn't wanted Elena. He had wanted the feeling of being the kind of man who could win Elena. He had wanted to possess something beautiful so that beauty might somehow transfer to him like a magical property absorbed through proximity. In the weeks that followed, Marcus found himself unable to explain what had happened to his friends. How could he tell them that he had lost something he had never actually wanted? How could he describe the unique humiliation of discovering that his deepest desire had been nothing more than a performance of desire, a shadow puppet show he had been staging for an audience of one? The trap had been perfect in its simplicity. Elena's desirability had made him feel valuable, but only as long as she remained a fantasy. The moment she became real, flawed, complex, independent, she shattered the very illusion that had made her seem worth pursuing. He had wanted to capture lightning in a bottle, but lightning was never meant to be contained. This is the architecture of masculine romantic delusion, what psychologists call objectification with a romantic veneer, and coined initially through feminist psychological theory. This concept describes the unconscious reduction of another person to a collection of desired attributes rather than seeing them as a complete, autonomous individual. It manifests in modern dating culture through the endless swipe of dating apps, where potential partners become a curated selection of photos and bullet points. It appears in workplace dynamics, where men mistake professional competence for personal availability. It lives in the gap between who we say we want to love and who we actually choose to see. Through Schopenhauer's lens, this represents the will's most elegant deception, convincing us that our deepest suffering comes from not getting what we want, when in truth, it comes from wanting the wrong things entirely. The will tricks us into pursuing objects of desire precisely because it knows the pursuit will ultimately leave us empty, ensuring the cycle of suffering continues. Marcus didn't lose Elena. He lost the comfortable illusion that his happiness could be found in acquiring someone else's substance. The ancients called it the curse of King Midas. Today, psychology names it objectification with a romantic veneer, what sits in your empty frames, waiting to complete the exhibition of who you think you should be. When you strip away the gold leaf and perfect lighting, what are you really trying to capture? And who are you refusing to see in the process? Some hungers can only be satisfied by learning not to hunt. Two masks hang on a theater dressing room wall. One smiles radiantly. The other weeps in anguish. Between them sits an empty chair, waiting for someone brave enough to wear neither. David had mastered the art of being exactly what women wanted, not through any natural charisma or authentic charm, but through years of careful observation and methodical adaptation. He was a social shapeshifter, reading cues with the precision of a master forger, studying brushstrokes, confident with women who desired strength, vulnerable with those drawn to sensitivity, intellectual with the bookish ones, playfully irreverent with those who prized humor above all else. His apartment reflected this calculated versatility, shelves lined with books he'd never read but knew how to reference, a guitar he'd learned to play just well enough to seem mysteriously artistic, workout equipment positioned to suggest dedication without appearing obsessive. He had become a living Pinterest board of masculine appeal, every detail curated to trigger the right response in the right woman at the right moment. For years, this strategy had worked flawlessly. His dating life resembled a carefully orchestrated performance where he played different characters for different audiences. Never quite the same person twice, but always exactly what was needed. He told himself this was sophistication. The ability to connect with anyone, to become whatever the moment required. He was proud of his adaptability, his emotional intelligence, his uncanny ability to make women feel seen and understood. But there was a problem growing in the space between who he pretended to be and who he actually was, though he couldn't yet see it clearly. The problem had a name: Sarah. Sarah was different from his usual conquests. She wasn't looking for a specific type of man. She was looking for an actual person. When David deployed his usual repertoire of calculated vulnerabilities and rehearsed profundities, she listened with the kind of attention that made him nervous. She asked follow-up questions that required real answers. She remembered details he'd forgotten he'd shared, creating a web of consistency he hadn't planned for. Most unsettling of all, Sarah seemed genuinely interested in the moments when his performance slipped, when he forgot which version of himself he was supposed to be and something unguarded flickered across his face. She would lean forward during these lapses, as if she'd finally caught a glimpse of something worth her attention. The relationship deepened, despite David's growing anxiety about maintaining his various personas. He found himself working harder than ever to stay in character. But Sarah's presence seemed to amplify every inconsistency. She began pointing out contradictions with the gentle persistence of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Last week, you said you loved hiking, but you seem reluctant that every time I suggest we go outside. You talk about your passion for photography, but I've never seen you take a picture. Sometimes you seem like a completely different person than the one I met. Quite. As Schopenhauer observed, the will to live manifests not just in our desires, but in our desperate need to be desired, and this need can transform us into performers in our own lives, slaves to other people's expectations, rather than masters of our own authentic existence. David tried to explain these inconsistencies away, weaving elaborate backstories to justify his contradictions, but Sarah wasn't interrogating him. She was simply paying attention, and attention, as David was learning, was the most dangerous thing a performance artist could face from his audience. The breaking point came during a dinner party at Sarah's apartment. Her friends were artists, writers, graduate students, people comfortable with ambiguity and depth, suspicious of anyone who seemed too polished or rehearsed. David found himself cycling through different personalities throughout the evening, trying to find the right fit for each conversation. He was the worldly traveler with Sarah's photographer friend, the sensitive intellectual with her poet roommate, the practical pragmatist with her engineer colleague. But something horrible was happening. The more he shifted and adapted, the more transparent his performance became. Sarah's friends began exchanging glances, not cruel or mocking, but confused and slightly concerned. They were watching a man dissolve in real time, becoming less solid with each attempted transformation. Sarah pulled him aside during dessert. "Who are you?" she asked, not angrily, but with genuine curiosity, tinged with something that might have been pity. "I've been dating you for 4 months, and I realize I don't know the answer to that question. Do you?" David opened his mouth to respond, to deploy one of his carefully crafted explanations, but found himself facing a terrifying void, stripped of his personas, confronted with the simple question of his own identity. He discovered that there might not be anything underneath all the performance. He had become so skilled at being what others wanted that he had forgotten how to want anything for himself. The humiliation wasn't that Sarah rejected him. It was that she had seen through him so completely that there was nothing left to reject. She had exposed the elaborate emptiness at the center of his romantic strategy. All his careful study of women, all his adaptive expertise, had been in service of hiding the fact that he had no authentic self to offer. In the weeks after Sarah ended the relationship, David found himself sitting in his carefully curated apartment, surrounded by props for a play he no longer knew how to perform. The books felt accusatory. The guitar seemed to mock him. The workout equipment stood like abandoned set pieces from a production that had closed without notice. He realized that his pursuit of women hadn't been about connection at all. It had been about validation. Each successful seduction had been evidence that his performance was convincing, that he could manufacture the appearance of depth and authenticity well enough to fool someone into caring about him. But Sarah hadn't been fooled, and her clarity had shattered the comfortable delusion that his masks were sufficient substitutes for an actual face. This is the psychology of what researchers call performative authenticity, a paradoxical state where individuals become so focused on appearing genuine that they lose touch with their actual, authentic impulses. Originally studied in the context of social media behavior, this phenomenon has expanded to describe how modern dating culture incentivizes the performance of depth rather than its cultivation. It manifests in the endless optimization of dating profiles, the strategic vulnerability, sharing in early relationships, the careful curation of spontaneous moments designed to seem effortless. Schopenhauer would recognize this as the will's cruelest joke, convincing us that our value lies in our ability to be desired by others, turning us into hollow performers on the stage of our own lives. The will ensures our suffering by making us dependent on external validation while simultaneously making authentic connection impossible through our very desperation to achieve it. In myth, it was the curse of the shapeshifter, doomed to wear every face but his own. Today, psychology names it performative authenticity. What character are you playing in the theater of your own life? When all the masks come off, what looks back at you from the mirror? And do you have the courage to love what you see there, or does that scare you more than being alone? The most dangerous performance is the one you forget you're giving. A golden pedestal stands in an empty museum hall, its surface worn smooth by countless hands reaching upward. At its base lies a discarded theater mask, its painted smile cracked down the middle. James believed in the religion of exceptional women. Not all women. That would have been too simple, too democratic for his sophisticated taste. James worshipped at the altar of the remarkable ones, the ones who seemed to glide above the ordinary chaos of human existence with an otherworldly grace that made him feel both elevated and utterly inadequate in their presence. His apartment reflected this devotion. Shelves lined with poetry collections by women writers whose words moved him to a state approaching religious ecstasy, photographs of female artists and intellectuals whose gazes seemed to judge him from gilded frames, classical music composed by the rare women who had managed to break through the masculine fortress of high culture. He had created a shrine to feminine transcendence, and he knelt before it daily, offering his reverence to the idea that somewhere out there existed women so luminous, so spiritually advanced, that loving them might transform him into something worthy of their radiance. This was not the crude objectification of lesser men who reduced women to bodies and services. James was far too evolved for such base desires. His objectification was refined, artistic, philosophical. He reduced women to their most ethereal qualities, their capacity to inspire and elevate, their ability to serve as muses for his own spiritual development. He sought goddesses, not partners. When he met Dr. Rachel Martinez at a university lecture on contemporary feminist philosophy, James felt the familiar electric surge that told him he had encountered another member of his personal pantheon. Rachel was exactly the kind of woman he had trained himself to recognize: intellectually formidable, emotionally complex, possessed of the kind of depth that seemed to promise endless excavation. She spoke about power structures with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of a revolutionary. She was, in his mind, perfect, which should have been his first warning. The early stages of their relationship unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance, with James playing the role of the devoted acolyte, seeking wisdom from an enlightened master. He hung on her every word, interpreted her casual observations as profound insights, treated her ordinary human emotions as sacred mysteries worthy of meditation and analysis. He was in love, he told himself, with her mind, her spirit, her essential, extraordinary nature. Rachel being an actual human being rather than the archetype James had cast her as, initially found his devotion flattering but increasingly suffocating. She began to notice how he never disagreed with her, never challenged her ideas, never seemed to have strong opinions of his own that might create productive friction. Conversations became monologues, with James serving as an enthusiastic but passive audience to her thoughts and feelings. More troubling was his reaction when she displayed normal human imperfections. When she was tired and snapped at a slow barista, James seemed genuinely confused, as if witnessing a glitch in a perfect system. When she admitted to feeling insecure about her appearance or uncertain about her career direction, he rushed to reassure her with a fervor that felt less like support and more like damage control, as if her self-doubt threatened the very foundations of his worldview. As Schopenhauer understood, what we call love is often merely the will's strategy for ensuring its own continuation, disguised as noble sentiment. But some men take this further, transforming their romantic partners into idealized objects of worship, believing this elevation represents the highest form of love when it actually represents the most subtle form of possession. The crisis came 6 months into their relationship, during what should have been an ordinary Tuesday evening. Rachel had returned from a particularly difficult day of department politics and academic bureaucracy, feeling drained and slightly defeated. She wanted comfort, someone to share her frustration with, a partner who could sit with her in the messy reality of professional disappointment. Instead, she got James in full priest of the exceptional mode, treating her career struggles as opportunities for profound philosophical reflection on the nature of institutional resistance to transformative ideas. He turned her complaints into lectures about the historical persecution of brilliant women, her frustration into evidence of her rare sensitivity to injustice. He couldn't simply let her be tired and annoyed. He had to make her tiredness and annoyance spiritually significant. "Sometimes," Rachel finally said, her voice carrying a weariness that had nothing to do with her workday, "I just wanted to complain about my boring job without you turning it into a meditation on the feminine divine or whatever this is." The words hit James like a physical blow. For the first time, he saw himself clearly through her eyes. Not a devoted partner, but a religious fanatic who had mistaken worship for love. He had been so busy venerating Rachel that he had forgotten to actually know her. He had loved her as a symbol while completely ignoring her as a person. The relationship ended not with anger, but with something worse. Rachel's gentle, pitying explanation that she needed to be with someone who could love her humanity rather than her idealized perfection. She needed someone who could disagree with her, challenge her, see her flaws, and choose her anyway. She needed a partner, not a worshiper. In the hollow weeks that followed, James found himself unable to explain to his friends what had gone wrong. How could he tell them that he had loved Rachel too much, in the wrong way, with an intensity that had somehow become a form of erasure? How could he describe the particular agony of discovering that his greatest capacity for love was actually his greatest failure at loving? He began to recognize the pattern that had repeated throughout his romantic life. His attraction to exceptional women had nothing to do with who they actually were, and everything to do with what their exceptionality did for his own sense of himself. He didn't want to love remarkable women. He wanted to be the kind of man who was worthy of remarkable women. He had been using their luminosity to illuminate his own worth, turning every relationship into a referendum on his spiritual evolution. The pedestal he had built wasn't for them at all, it was for him. By worshiping women who seemed to transcend ordinary human limitations, he had elevated himself above the men who loved ordinary women in ordinary ways. His reverence had been a form of spiritual pride, his devotion a disguised form of narcissism. This is the psychology of what researchers term benevolent objectification, a form of dehumanization that appears positive on its surface but reduces individuals to idealized symbols rather than complete persons. First identified in studies of gender dynamics, this pattern manifests in various forms. The perfect mother syndrome that places impossible expectations on women's nurturing abilities, the wise woman archetype that burdens female leaders with unrealistic demands for emotional perfection, and the romantic idealization that transforms partners into muses rather than allowing them to be human beings with their own needs and desires. Schopenhauer would see this as the will's most sophisticated trap, convincing us that our desire to transcend ordinary existence through contact with the extraordinary is actually spiritual evolution, when it's merely another form of using others to fill our own existential emptiness. The will ensures our suffering by making us dependent on finding salvation through other people's perfection, guaranteeing disappointment when they inevitably reveal their humanity. The Greeks called it the Pygmalion complex, the dangerous love of one's own creation. Today, psychology names it benevolent objectification. Who are you trying to transform through the power of your devotion? When you strip away the golden light you've cast on them, can you love what remains? Or does their ordinariness terrify you more than being alone with your own unexceptional self? The highest form of worship is learning to see clearly. A rope bridge stretches across a chasm, disappearing into fog so thick that neither end is visible. Halfway across, a man sits motionless, unable to move forward or back, clutching a compass that spins wildly in his hands. Thomas lived in the space between decisions, and he had made that space his home. While other men rushed headlong into relationships, making messy declarations and risking ugly rejections, Thomas had perfected the art of the eternal maybe. He existed in the delicious tension of romantic possibility, building elaborate architectures of potential connection while carefully never finishing the construction. His life was a masterpiece of strategic ambiguity. text conversations that danced right up to the edge of confession without ever crossing the line, dinner invitations that could be interpreted as dates or friendly meals, depending on how the evening unfolded, compliments calibrated to be meaningful enough to register, but vague enough to provide escape routes. He had learned to live in the spaces between words, the pauses between intentions, the gray areas where hope could flourish without ever facing the harsh light of actual resolution. This wasn't cowardice, Thomas told himself. It was sophistication. While other men blundered through the minefield of modern romance, triggering explosions of rejection and embarrassment, he moved like a ghost, leaving barely a trace, never quite vulnerable enough to be hurt. He had discovered something that felt like a superpower, the ability to remain perpetually on the verge of love without ever having to risk actually falling into it. The pattern had emerged during graduate school, when Thomas developed what he privately called the philosophy student approach to romantic interaction. He would engage women in deep, meaningful conversations that bordered on intimate without ever becoming personal. He would share books and ideas and late-night discussions about the nature of connection, creating bonds that felt profound while remaining technically ambiguous. Women would leave these encounters feeling like they had glimpsed something rare and interesting in him, but unable to name exactly what had passed between them. This approach served him well for years. He accumulated a circle of female friends who seemed perpetually intrigued by his mysterious unavailability, women who would text him late at night with questions that weren't quite questions, invitations that weren't quite invitations. He lived in a state of constant romantic possibility, surrounded by potential that never demanded actualization. But Thomas had not accounted for Maya. Maya was a photographer who specialized in capturing moments of transition, the instant when day became night, when seasons shifted, when expressions changed from one emotion to another. She had an artist's eye for the spaces between things, which made her uniquely qualified to see through Thomas's carefully constructed ambiguity. When they met at a gallery opening, Thomas deployed his usual strategy of meaningful eye contact and conversation that hovered tantalizingly close to personal revelation. But Maya responded with a directness that threw him completely off balance. "Are you always this careful about not saying what you mean?" she asked, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity, as if she were studying an interesting specimen. The question haunted him because it was precisely accurate. Thomas realized he had become so skilled at not saying what he meant that he had lost track of what he meant entirely. His conversations had become elaborate performances of depth without any actual depths to draw from. He was like a magician who had become so obsessed with the technique of illusion that he had forgotten what reality looked like. As Schopenhauer observed, the will often disguises our deepest fears as our greatest virtues. What we call wisdom might simply be elaborate strategies for avoiding the suffering that comes with genuine engagement with life's uncertainties. Maya began pursuing Thomas with the patience of someone photographing a rare bird. She seemed genuinely fascinated by his reluctance to commit to any definitive position about anything, including his own feelings. But unlike his other female friends, she didn't interpret his ambiguity as mysterious depth. She saw it as a fascinating form of self-imprisonment. "You know what I think?" she said one evening as they walked through the city after another one of their not-quite dates. "I think you're not afraid of being rejected. I think you're afraid of being accepted. I think you're terrified that if you actually told someone how you felt, they might say yes, and then you'd have to figure out what comes next." The observation landed with the precision of a surgeon's blade cutting through years of carefully constructed self-mythology. Thomas realized that Maya was right. His elaborate system of romantic ambiguity wasn't protecting him from rejection. It was protecting him from the possibility of getting what he claimed to want. He had become addicted to the safety of perpetual potential, the comfort of never having to test his fantasies against reality. The crisis came when Maya, with characteristic directness, forced the issue. "I like you," she said over coffee on a Tuesday morning, her words carrying the weight of absolute clarity. "I'm interested in dating you, not dancing around the possibility of dating you. If you're interested too, say so. If you're not, that's fine, but I'm not going to spend months deciphering your secret codes." Thomas felt the familiar panic that came whenever one of his carefully maintained ambiguities threatened to collapse into actual decision. But this time, something different happened. Instead of deploying his usual arsenal of deflection and delay, he found himself facing a terrible question. What did he actually want? The answer, when it came, was devastating in its simplicity. He wanted to want something. He had spent so many years protecting himself from disappointment that he had lost the ability to desire anything strongly enough to risk losing it. His sophisticated ambiguity was just fear wearing the mask of wisdom. He tried to explain this to Maya, to buy time while he figured out how to feel genuine desire for something other than the safety of not choosing. But Maya, being an artist of transitions, recognized the moment when someone was trying to remain suspended between one state and another indefinitely. She had captured enough such moments through her camera lens to know they couldn't last forever. "The thing about living in maybe," she said as she prepared to leave his life, "is that eventually maybe becomes no, not because you chose no, but because you never chose yes." After she was gone, Thomas found himself alone with the architecture he had built, an elaborate maze of possibilities that led nowhere, bridges to destinations he had never allowed himself to reach. He had mastered the art of romantic suspension. But suspension, he discovered, was not the same as flight. It was just a more sophisticated form of falling. This is what psychologists call commitment phobia with intellectual justification, a pattern where individuals use philosophical complexity to mask their fundamental fear of emotional vulnerability. Originally studied in attachment theory, this manifests in modern dating culture as situationships that never evolve into relationships, keeping options open that prevents any option from being fully explored, and the endless analysis of romantic dynamics that substitutes for actually experiencing them. Schopenhauer would see this as the will's most subtle deception, convincing us that our avoidance of commitment represents philosophical sophistication when it's actually a strategy for avoiding the suffering that comes with genuine desire. The will keeps us suspended in endless possibility because actualized desire inevitably leads to either satisfaction, which is temporary, or loss, which is painful, while potential desire can be maintained indefinitely without resolution. The ancients called it the curse of Tantalus, eternally reaching for fruit that retreats at the moment of contact. Today, psychology names it commitment phobia with intellectual justification. What are you afraid might happen if you stopped living in the space between decisions? When you remove the fog that keeps both ends of the bridge invisible, what do you see there that terrifies you? Success or failure? And which one scares you more? Sometimes the most dangerous place to stand is exactly where you feel safest. An empty throne sits in a circular room with no doors, its velvet cushions worn thin by the weight of someone who never learned to rise. Around its base, scattered like fallen leaves, lie the cracked pieces of what might once have been a mirror, each shard reflecting nothing but darkness. Michael had mastered the art of heroic suffering, not the quiet endurance of ordinary hardship, but the theatrical agony of a man whose capacity for love was so vast, so pure, so tragically unrecognized that the world itself seemed to conspire against his noble heart. He had transformed rejection into a form of spiritual practice, disappointment into evidence of his superior sensitivity, and romantic failure into proof of his too refined nature for the crude realities of modern love. His apartment had become a monument to beautiful melancholy, walls lined with the literature of doomed romance, music that spoke to souls too deep for shallow happiness, artwork that had captured the exquisite pain of unrequited longing. He had created a sanctuary for his wounded heart, a place where his suffering could be honored as the sacred burden of men who loved too well for their own good. The pattern had crystallized during his 30s, after a series of relationships that had ended with women telling him they needed space to grow, or wanted to explore other options, or simply felt suffocated by his intensity. Each rejection had carved deeper grooves into his psyche, creating channels through which all subsequent romantic disappointment would flow. He began to see these failures not as individual incompatibilities or timing issues, but as symptom of a world that had lost its capacity to recognize authentic devotion. Michael's dating life became a carefully orchestrated drama in which he played the role of the misunderstood romantic, the last knight in an age that no longer valued chivalry. He would approach women with the reverence of someone approaching an altar, offering them a level of attention and adoration that felt overwhelming rather than flattering. When they inevitably pulled back from his intensity, he would interpret their retreat as evidence of their spiritual poverty, their inability to handle real love. He began keeping what he privately called the archive, detailed journals documenting each romantic disappointment, analyzing the ways each woman had failed to appreciate his depth, cataloging the evidence of his superior capacity for love. These journals became his scripture, texts he would return to whenever the world tried to suggest that perhaps the problem lay not with the women who rejected him, but with his approach to loving them. The most seductive aspect of this system was how it transformed every failure into a form of victory. When Sarah left him for someone less intense, it proved his spiritual superiority. When Jennifer said she felt smothered by his constant attention, it demonstrated her inability to handle authentic intimacy. When Amanda described his love letters as a bit much, it revealed her tragic shallowness. Each rejection became another brick in the cathedral of his romantic martyrdom. But the system began to crack when Michael encountered Dr. Lisa Chen, a therapist who specialized in attachment disorders and had developed an unfortunate ability to see through the elaborate mythologies people constructed around their relational patterns. Unlike his usual targets, women who were either too polite to name his behavior or too confused by his intensity to respond clearly, Lisa possessed the professional vocabulary to describe exactly what she was witnessing. "You know what's interesting?" she said during what Michael had intended to be their third date, but which had become an impromptu therapy session in disguise. "You talk about love like it's something you do to people rather than something you do with them, like it's a performance you're giving rather than a relationship you're building." As Schopenhauer recognized, the will often convinces us that our deepest attachments to our own suffering represent spiritual development, when they're actually the most subtle form of self-imprisonment. We become addicted to the drama of our own pain because it provides us with an identity that feels more substantial than our actual self. Michael tried to explain to Lisa that she was witnessing something rare, a man who still believed in the transformative power of unconditional love in an age of casual connection and emotional unavailability. But Lisa, with the terrible clarity that comes from having seen this pattern hundreds of times in her practice, recognized something different. A man who had fallen in love with his own capacity for suffering and had convinced himself it was the same thing as a capacity for love. "The problem isn't that you love too much," she continued, her voice carrying the gentle precision of someone delivering a necessary wound. "The problem is that you've confused loving with performing love, and you've confused suffering with depth. You're not a romantic hero. You're someone who's found a way to make rejection feel like validation." The words hit Michael like a physical blow because they carried the ring of truth he had spent years insulating himself against. For the first time, he saw his pattern clearly. He wasn't seeking connection, he was seeking situations that would confirm his worldview. He wasn't offering love. He was offering a theatrical performance of love that was designed to be too much for anyone to accept. He had become addicted to the exquisite pain of rejection because it fed his sense of being too pure for this world. Lisa, being a professional who understood the difference between therapeutic insight and romantic compatibility, gently extracted herself from their emerging dynamic before it could follow its predictable trajectory. But her departure was different from all the others. Instead of leaving Michael with another story of unappreciated devotion, she left him with a mirror that reflected something he had never seen before, a man who had mistaken his attachment to his own pain for evidence of his capacity for love. In the weeks that followed, Michael found himself unable to return to the archive, unable to find comfort in the familiar narratives of his romantic martyrdom. Lisa's words had introduced a virus into his carefully constructed system, the possibility that his suffering was not noble but simply suffering, that his rejections were not evidence of his superiority, but feedback about behavior that was genuinely problematic. He began to see how he had weaponized his own sensitivity, using his capacity for pain as evidence that he was more evolved than the people who hurt him. He had created a romantic philosophy that made it impossible for him to succeed while ensuring that every failure felt like a form of success. He had become a phoenix that had learned to love the fire so much that it never flew away from it. This is what psychologists term victimhood superiority complex, a defensive pattern where individuals transform their relational failures into evidence of their moral or emotional superiority. Originally identified in studies of narcissistic personality patterns, this phenomenon manifests in modern culture through the romanticization of toxic relationships on social media, the glorification of unrequited love in popular culture, and the transformation of dating app rejection into evidence of being too real for superficial connections. It appears in the workplace as the colleague who interprets feedback as persecution, in friendships as the person who sees every boundary as betrayal, and in family dynamics as the relative who transforms every conflict into proof of their exceptional sensitivity. Schopenhauer would recognize this as the will's most insidious trap, convincing us that our attachment to our own suffering represents spiritual evolution when it's actually a sophisticated form of ego protection. The will ensures our continued misery by making us dependent on our pain for our sense of identity, transforming every potential moment of healing into a threat to our carefully constructed sense of self. The Romans called it the Cassandra complex, cursed to speak truths no one could hear. Today, Psychology names it victimhood, superiority, complex. What throne have you built from your own rejected love letters? When you burn down the cathedral of your romantic martyrdom, what rises from those ashes? A phoenix finally ready to fly, or just another man who has learned that some cages are too comfortable to leave? The most dangerous prison is the one you've convinced yourself is a palace.